And the Oscar for Best Georgia Football Podcast goes to Connor in Coverage. Hi, my name is Connor Riley, and tonight we'll be talking about Georgia football spring practice, pro day, and everything else in between, as it figures to be a very busy week for the Georgia football program. Hello, everyone, and welcome into this week's edition of Connor in Coverage. My name is Connor Riley. Plenty to talk about on this busy Sunday. Obviously, much of it here going to be dedicated to Georgia football, but NCAA tournament bracket was revealed today. Your 4-1 seeds: Alabama number one overall, Purdue, Houston, and Kansas. You have the Oscars later tonight as well. And what should be a very busy week for Georgia football. Kirby Smart is set to meet with the media on Tuesday. His first public comments since the day after the national championship game. I will be on hand. Mike Griffith will be on hand. We'll have tons of video, written content, social media stuff coming out of what should be a very newsy day for a number of reasons there. And then on Wednesday, you have Georgia's Pro Day as well, where once again, not necessarily always for good reasons, but we will have plenty to talk about coming out of that Wednesday workout where, you obviously have the 12 Georgia players who were in the combine in Indianapolis. You also have a couple other guys who are trying to make it to the NFL. We've seen in recent years guys at Georgia who were not invited to the combine end up becoming draft picks. That was the case for Charlie Warner in the 2021 NFL draft. That was the case for John Fitzpatrick this past season. So tons to look forward to this week. Spring practice officially gets underway for the Bulldogs on Tuesday. That is where our attention starts tonight. It's going to be a very important spring practice, as almost all of these always are. And I guess the newsy angle we should probably take first is there are going to be players out there dealing with injuries, guys we don't know about yet. You can just look time and time again. Georgia's been missing key contributors during spring practice in the past. And more often than not, it's turned out to be fine. Nakobe Dean did not have a spring practice during the 2021 spring going into the fall of that season. George Pickens famously tore his ACL in spring practice and found a way to come back and make a big impact at the end of the season there last year. Darnell Washington did not have spring practice. Brock Bowers did not have spring practice. Shmuel Munden did not have spring practice. The offseason is a time for guys to get cleaned up both physically and mentally and get in a spot where they can get their bodies right for the fall. We already know Marvin Jones is going to be one of those guys who will not be out there for spring practice, as he had a labrum injury that required surgery to get cleaned up there. There are a couple guys we're interested in seeing where their status is. Ernest Green, I think, is a big name to monitor and know at that left tackle or tackle position in general there. He's a guy who missed most of last season due to a back injury, but there's a lot of expectations surrounding Green and what he can ultimately become for Georgia. And the thought might be that he and Amarius Mims are going to be your two starting offensive tackles. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Ernest Green is a limited participant at times during this spring practice, just given the nature of back injuries, especially for someone at Ernest Green's size. I think you can expect to see a guy like Austin Blaske take some real snaps there at that left tackle position and battle him there as well. Other guys that are coming back from injuries that occurred during the 2022 season, you have Andrew Paul, who's working his way back from an ACL injury that occurred in August of 2022. We'll see what his status is. Dan Jackson, obviously safety is going to be one of the positions to watch there for Georgia, given Chris Smith moving on to the NFL, and they have a lot of different bodies they can throw at that position. Obviously, Dan Jackson is the most experienced of the bunch, but guys like David Daniels-Savannah, Smoke Bowie, Javon Bullard potentially there as well, along with the fact Janelle Aguero, top 50 overall prospect in this last recruiting class, a guy that many people think is going to be a very good safety for Georgia. We'll get to see our first chance at him during spring practice here. Aguero is one of 18 early enrollees. We'll see how many of them are out there and available at practice. Obviously, last year you saw guys come in, get cleaned up. Bear Alexander, CJ Madden, guys who had pre-existing high school injuries and had to get those fixed and repaired. And so we'll see how many of those guys are out there. Obviously, a lot of eyes are going to be on Damon Wilson, the edge rusher, what he might be able to bring, given that position is pretty light for Georgia in terms of a health standpoint right now, with Nolan Smith and Robert Beal both moving on to the NFL. You also have guys like Tyler Williams, Yazeed Haynes, Anthony Evans at the tight end position. What do Lawson Lucky and Pierce Sperling continue to bring, an inside linebacker? There has been nothing but praise heaped on CJ Allen so far. I'm interested in seeing what he looks like in his first spring at the University of Georgia. He got really strong reviews coming out of bowl practice. I think Braylon Wilson is as high a ceiling as anyone in this 2022 Georgia football class. So a lot of interesting new faces we'll get to see, along with the three transfers, Smoke Bowie in the defensive backfield, and then Dominic Lovett and Rob Thomas at the wide receiver position there as well. So plenty of new faces coming in. I think from a position standpoint, and we'll sort of transition here into our next topic, the quarterback position. Georgia has to replace Stetson Bennett. Stetson Bennett was a Heisman Trophy finalist. He was the starting quarterback for largely the last 2 seasons. And behind him, I believe there is something like 63 career passing attempts in between the 3 players trying to replace Bennett at that quarterback position, in Carson Beck, Brock Vandagriff, and Gunnar Stockton. I'm sure we're going to spend many Sunday nights over the course of spring practice talking about these guys, breaking things down, where they are, the progress that's being made. I don't expect a starting quarterback to be named coming out of spring. I think they're going to want to continue this competition in the fall, even continue it into the season, given the cupcake nature of Georgia's schedule to start the 2023 season. And, Carson Beck, I wrote about him last week. Gunnar Stockton, I wrote about him last week as well. I think a lot of people are interested in seeing what those guys do and how they go out there and perform and compete going into spring practice. I would say that Carson Beck is probably a sizable favorite to win the job. He really impressed last year as the backup, really knows that he has to attack this offseason and show that he is not just the best of the 3 quarterbacks competing for that starting job, but he is the best quarterback for this team and this offense going forward. And it'll be interesting to see how he steps up to that challenge, given he's had chances in the past to win a job. He won the backup quarterback job last year. We thought he had won it in 2021. He gets beat out by Stetson Bennett there. And so it'll be interesting to sort of see with Carson Beck where things go with him this spring. And then obviously Gunnar Stockton, a fantastic competitor. Everyone raves about the intangible aspects that he brings to this team. I think from a raw skill set standpoint, he's probably the guy that is closest to what Stetson Bennett was a season ago. And so it'll be interesting seeing how he fits into Mike Bobo's offense there, especially given the long history that Bobo and Stockton have together. And, I think a spring practice atmosphere sets up really nicely for a guy like Gunnar Stockton, who is at his best in sort of a natural competition standpoint and is a very talented player. And having touched on both Carson Beck and now Gunnar Stockton, I think the guy who maybe above everyone on this roster this spring, the guy I'm most interested in seeing and doing some reporting on and learning about is Brock Vandagriff, because sort of hanging over all of this, he's still very much in this quarterback competition. It would not surprise me if he somehow found a way to win this quarterback competition. But sort of hanging over all of it is the looming question of, well, is Brock or one of the other quarterbacks ultimately going to transfer? And I think right now, sitting here on March 12th, I think if one of these guys is a transfer, I think a lot of people would think that Vandagriff would be that guy, simply by the fact that Gunnar Stockton is younger than Vandagriff and thus has more time potentially to win and earn a job in the Georgia system. And then you have Beck, who is the presumed starter. So that leaves a guy like Brock Vandagriff right in the middle of there. And so it'll be interesting, not just during spring, but in that transfer portal window from May 1st to May 15th, what does Vandagriff or any of these quarterbacks ultimately decide to do as far as sticking around at Georgia or electing to go elsewhere? In my story that I did on Carson on Thursday, I looked at, past recruiting rankings of the top 20 quarterbacks in the 2020 recruiting class, which is where Carson Beck was. Beck was ranked 19th overall. Of those 20 quarterbacks, 13 have already entered the transfer portal. Another 3 are off to the NFL, and Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, and Anthony Richardson. There are four players from that 2020 quarterback recruiting cycle that are still with their original teams. Carson Beck is the only one of those 4 that has not started a game yet. You have Evan Prater at Cincinnati, you have Tyler Van Dyke at Miami, and then you have Luke Doty at South Carolina. And obviously Doty's not going to be starting for South Carolina this year, but he has starting experience in the past with the Gamecocks. With Beck, he is as close to an anomaly and an unknown for a 4th-year quarterback as you see, especially at the high major level in college football nowadays. And there's a lot to like about Beck and what he might ultimately become. I think he's made great strides both physically and mentally as well. In the story that you can read on Dog Nation, he talked a lot about really honing in on the mental side and being consistently great, which is what is needed from that Georgia position. And then flipping this back to talk about Brock Vandagriff. Brock Vandagriff came in with a ton of hype. He was a 5-star quarterback, a local kid from Prince Avenue Prince Avenue Christian here in the Athens area. Has as high an upside as I think anyone in that quarterback room. Is a true dual threat quarterback and perhaps a better athlete than Carson Beck. And it'll be interesting to see what he's able to do this spring. Obviously, they're going to give a ton of reps to Beck, Vandagriff, and Stockton. I think Kirby Smart, as much as the idea exists that they might want to find out who the guy is as soon as possible, they're going to exhaust every single option to see who is capable of being the quarterback for this team. And with all that lingers around Vandagriff, given his time as a recruit, given we just don't know a whole lot about him. He was in, I don't want to call it an unfortunate position, but he clearly wasn't the backup last year. That was Carson Beck. And he wasn't working with the scout team either because those reps went to Gunnar Stockton, a role that Vandagriff himself had when he was a freshman. And so last year, Brock Vandagriff wasn't getting a ton of reps. I believe he only had 3 passing attempts during the course of the season. And I believe he has technically not completed a pass yet in his Georgia career. So as he's entering year 3, we just don't know a ton about Brock Vandagriff, the college football player. We know what he was as a recruit, very talented player, originally committed to Oklahoma when Lincoln Riley was the head coach there. But I'm really interested in this spring. I think this is really the first time we're going to get a chance to follow along and really get to see what Brock Vandagriff is about and what he brings to this football team and ultimately what it's going to look like in a real quarterback battle, rather, for really first time since 2020. But even then, that had a lot of outstanding circumstances given COVID, given Jamie Newman opting out, JT Daniels transferring in. When is JT Daniels going to be healthy there? This time around, this is a true quarterback battle. Well, yeah, I do think Carson Beck has the leg up to start the process, but over the course of the next month and then obviously throughout the rest of this offseason, all 3 of these guys are going to battle and compete. And it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Gunnar Stockton finds a way to win this, if Brock Vandagriff finds a way to win this, if Carson Beck were to find a way to win this. So I think they're all viable options, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all plays out and what it all ultimately means for Georgia as they try to win a 3rd consecutive national championship. So touching a little bit there on the quarterback battle, previewing it, what to look ahead to, sort of piggybacking off what I had just said about Vandagriff. Some of the other guys that I'm just generally interested in learning about this spring, seeing how they react, how they compete. I touched on Earnest Greene at the top. What's his medical status going to be? He had a really strong spring last year, especially for a true freshman. He came in, played really well at that left tackle spot right away. And I'll be interested, just given the time off, given the nature of that back injury, how quickly he's able to get in there and really start making a name for himself once again. I think he's a guy who has a very high ceiling for Georgia, and they're going to need him because, as my colleague Jeff Santel pointed out, there's a very real world where Georgia's losing 4 starters from this year's offensive line to next year. And there's a good chance that if Earnest Greene is the guy that wins that left tackle job, he's your only returning starter. And so I'm interested in seeing, last year I think Greene had a chance to come in and learn. There wasn't necessarily a ton of pressure for him to start because Georgia knew it had Broderick Jones, who went on to be one of the best tackles in the SEC. And they knew they had Warren McClendon on the right side, who started 37 consecutive games in his college career. They need to know something about Earnest Greene this spring, and I'm interested in seeing what they learn about him and what they get out of that. I think a guy that's maybe been a little overlooked, a little underrated, that we haven't necessarily talked about a ton is Dominic Lovett. This was a guy that led Missouri in receiving last year, and he's one of 2 transfer wide receivers to come into the program this offseason. And Ra Thomas had a lot of headlines, not necessarily for the right reasons, as he was arrested earlier this offseason. One of those charges was dismissed, and he is working through getting the other charge expunged from his record. Thomas came from a pass-happy offense there, Mike Leach, and so naturally that I think leads him to put up a little bit more numbers and a little better. I was playing with Will Rogers, I think one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC, whereas the Missouri quarterback situation was not very good last year. And for Dominic Lovett, I think to still go out there and make the plays that he made, leading Missouri in receptions and receiving yards, and he did it against Georgia. I think 6 catches for 84 yards against a very good Georgia secondary, a national championship winning secondary anyway. I think he showed he can do some things there. And I'm really interested in seeing what he looks like playing for a bigger team, playing where he may not necessarily be the focal point of opposing defenses, given Ladd McConkey is going to be back, Brock Bowers is going to be back. Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, I think, is going to take another stride and step forward this offseason. You obviously have Thomas. Arian Smith's speed is a difference maker. I think this year's team is going to be more receiver-based, whereas last year's team, because you had Darnell Washington and Brock Bowers, two very different tight ends, this year's team is going to lean a lot more on those wide receivers just because I think it's a deeper position. I think it's a more talented position this year. And so you're going to see something along the lines of that. I do think, the offense for the most part is probably going to stay the same going from Monken to Bobo. It's just going to lean more on its wide receivers this year because that's where I think the strength of this offense is. Whereas at tight end, yes, you bring in Brock Bowers. Yes, Oscar Delp, I think, is going to be a very talented player. Lawson Lucky and Pierce Spurlin, which you highly recruited tight ends. Maybe you add Deuce Robinson to the mix there as well, potentially. But I think the wide receiver position is much better set up for success than it was a season ago. And so I'll be interested in seeing how that goes about at the wide receiver position, led by Dominic Lovett there. On the defensive side of the ball, I think we'll start in the secondary. Javon Bullard closed last season, I think, as well as anyone can, winning the MVP, defensive MVP rather, in both the Peach Bowl and the national championship game. And he did it in a half in the national championship game, coming down with 2 interceptions and a fumble recovery there as well. And I think Georgia's very content if they wanted to just leave him at that star position, let him continue to play that role. I think he did it very well last year for Georgia. But with Chris Smith moving on, do you maybe move Javon Bullard over to that safety position, given it is an opening and that allows you to play someone else at that star position? Maybe a Smoke Bowie. What does that look like? What is his role for this team? David Daniels-Sisvana as well, I think, is a guy who played in Georgia's dime package a season ago. What does it look like for him? Tyke Smith, now fully healthy and a spring practice for the first time in his Georgia career. What does he bring to this team this year? And I think it all sort of ties into how this Georgia secondary gets sorted out. For me, it ties back into what you get out of Javon Bullard and what the next step for him is in terms of being a playmaker in that secondary. Because prior to that prior to the TCU game, I believe he did not have an interception in his career, but he showed he is certainly capable of making some plays and being a more impactful player for Georgia, which Chris Smith certainly was for Georgia at that safety position. And Malachi Starks has shown the ability to do so as well there. So more of a known entity than some of the guys I touched on the offensive side of the ball. But I'm really interested in seeing what the next step is there for Javon Bullard. At the cornerback position, Dalen Everett enters, I think, pretty clearly as the favorite. I want to see how quickly he locks down that job and wins that job because there's a lot of talent at that cornerback position. Nyland Green is not going to make it easy, though I did note that he did have a cast on in a recent Instagram picture that he had posted. So you can add him to the list of guys that have maybe some injury questions at the start of spring practice there. You have Julian Humphrey, a guy that came in the same class as Everett. A.J. Harris was a 5-star cornerback in the 2023 recruiting cycle that will be going through drills this spring for Georgia. So you have a lot of talent at that cornerback position, but Georgia really liked what they got from Dalen Everett last year, came in right away. They know he can tackle. They know he can be physical. I think they'll be interested in seeing how he goes about taking those next steps and becoming a starting cornerback for Georgia. I think he's probably a bigger favorite than I would say Carson Beck is at the quarterback position and just comparing those two spots. But I'll be interested in seeing, last year, I think Kamari Lassiter was someone who entered a similar sort of situation where they had to replace Darian Kendrick. How quickly could Lassiter be the guy to lock that down? I think coming out of spring, we knew that Georgia felt very good about what they had in Kamari Lassiter. And you ultimately saw that there play out very well for Georgia over the course of the regular season. Transitioning here a little bit into our next topic, expectations for Pro Day. And this is maybe the unfun part of this show here tonight. Tuesday and Wednesday, if you're a Georgia fan, there's going to be a lot of questions asked by national media people. Tuesday is the first real public forum that Kirby Smart will have with reporters since the national championship game. You can imagine there will be a lot of questions about Devin Willock, about the investigation into the crash, about the various arrests that Georgia has seen this offseason. I'm not going to rehash all that here because, quite frankly, we don't need to. We've already done that. But there'll be a lot of national media people peeking in and asking questions about that. It won't be all football this week, and it can't be given the circumstances surrounding the events that have taken place this offseason. And that will continue on Wednesday as well with Georgia's Pro Day. A lot of eyes are going to be on that not just because it's Georgia. They had 12 guys at the combine. They dominated there once again. You've got potentially another 5 first-round draft picks. What happens with Jalen Carter? Did not speak in Indianapolis. He said he was going to do drills at Georgia. We'll see if that ends up holding out to be true. We'll see if he ends up speaking to reporters. Quite frankly, I don't think that it's going to happen given the circumstances surrounding his arrest there. But again, it's going to be a lot of eyes on Athens this week, not necessarily for the reasons you might think or not necessarily want if you are a Georgia football partisan. But I do think that, these questions do need to be answered and they need to be asked as well. And I'm not getting into, journalists because nobody here cares about that. But it is not going to be all about football this week. There will be questions that I'm sure, and we'll try and answer these the best we can when I get into our question and answer segment here shortly. There are going to be football related questions that we want answered, but quite frankly, have to be asked after some of the other questions that have transpired over the course of this week. So if it takes us a little bit longer to get to, what does a Mike Bobo hire mean? What does Kirby Smart say further about Bobo and the hiring process there of going from Monken to Bobo? If it takes us a little bit longer to get some of those answers, there are reasons for that. And so on that downer of a note there, let's clumsily transfer into our question and answer portion of the show tonight. Go ahead and ask them in the chat. I will note I'll probably be getting off here right around 8 o'clock-ish. I do intend on watching the Oscars. I'm a big movie person. Quite frankly, I think Top Gun Maverick should win Best Picture this year, and I'm filibustering at this point, so we can get some comments and questions here loaded in the chat. I thought Top Gun Maverick was an incredibly important movie just because it got movies back in the national conversation. I saw the movie 4 times in theaters. I've rewatched it twice since it came to a certain streaming platform there. And I think what it did for movies and what it showed for theaters in particular, I think is incredible. Everything Everywhere All at Once was an equally incredible film. I think it's going to win very many awards tonight. If you have not seen it, I would recommend going and doing so. Obviously, it's not going to be for everyone. I would say it's probably a movie that skews younger a little bit, but a fantastic movie, and I think it will very much be represented at the Academy Awards tonight. So with that and my filibustering done, let's go ahead and see what they have to say. Thoughts, comments, questions, guys you're interested in seeing. Let's see. Keep scrolling. Orange Shelley, certainly a possibility. Bullard at safety, and then you move Tyke Smith up to that star position there as well. So it'll be interesting in seeing what Georgia ultimately does at that safety position. I think it'll be one of the more, again, it is a hipster's position battle. Obviously, quarterback's going to command a lot of attention. I think the left tackle position is going to do so as well, cornerback as well. But that safety spot, and maybe it's easy to take advantage of it, simply because Georgia has just had continuously great safeties for Kirby Smart since he took over the program. J.R. Reed was a Thorpe Award finalist. Richard LeCount was playing great football in his time at Georgia. Chris Smith is as accomplished as they come. Lewis Cine was the first-round draft pick. They have had consistently excellent safety play, and I believe that's going to continue. My big question is Javon Bullard the guy that steps in there? Is it Dan Jackson? Who ultimately takes up that safety spot opposite Malachi Starks? Andrew Hughes. I think this is one of the more interesting questions for Pro Day this week. He has said that, and he being Jalen Carter, he has said that previously he was going to do so. I would expect him to maybe do positional drills, if that, and that'll be it. I don't expect him to run a 40. I don't expect him to do shuttle or anything like that. I mean, Jalen Carter, yes, he has to answer for the arrest and things that happen there. And I think there are going to be a lot of teams digging into that and other things about his time at the University of Georgia. But from a football playing standpoint, just turn on the tape. I mean, look, I've seen a lot of Georgia football in the past decade. I don't know if a player's had a better, say, 6-game run from when Jalen Carter came back against Florida through that LSU game. I have 5-6 games, however many games it was. I mean, he was utterly dominant for Georgia over that stretch. And so I think it'll be very, very interesting in terms of, how far does he ultimately fall in the draft? Quite frankly, I don't think he gets past the Detroit Lions at 6. I think 5 at Seattle is another spot for him to go. I don't think he's going to go number 1 overall. I don't think he's going to be the first defensive player off the board. I think that's going to be Will Anderson now, but I still think we won't have to wait very long to hear hear that name there. Ryan Kay, yes. Unfortunately, I think this is a hitting the nail on the head. As much as I love Top Gun Maverick, I don't expect it to win tonight because some people just lack vision, and that's just the reality there. I did see an earlier question that I did like. Who gets more snaps, Gunner or Brock? I think it's going to be pretty split. I think they're going to want to give all these guys the best chance that they can to show and impress their teammates and show what they can do. I think they're going to, while again, we think Carson Beck is the favorite to win this, I think it won't surprise me in the slightest if Kirby Smart goes out there and says straight up, yeah, this is completely open competition. Each three of these guys can go out there and win this job, because I believe that is certainly the case. And so it'll be interesting seeing how those reps get divvied out, especially in the spring. Fall practice, it's maybe a little bit different. Barry, to sort of better answer your question, but I think in the spring, I think it's going to be pretty open and pretty even, certainly between those two guys at that position there. Let's see. Jerry Dogs fan on YouTube asked, does Georgia have to get 2 QBs in this cycle? I think they very much want to, and I know that is the plan to do so. I think with the transfer portal, you can, lean on that a little bit. I just don't think that Georgia wants to. I think they'd much rather recruit 2 guys. I think, as Jerry mentions, Dylan Raiola and Ryan Puglisi are the top 2 choices. Obviously, Puglisi already committed there. Jake Mecklinger from the Savannah area is another name to know there as well. He is visiting Georgia this month, as is Raiola. So I think Georgia is very much wanting to get to. They don't necessarily have to, because I think, and Kirby has made this point before, the transfer portal is absolutely going to be an avenue for teams to add quarterback depth. I just don't think that that's what Georgia wants to do. Let's see. Keep scrolling, see if we have a few more questions here. Let's see. Philip Jordan Wells, first string defensive line. I will go. We'll go Michael Williams at defensive end at that 5 technique. I think you have Nazir Stackhouse in sort of that Jalen Carter 3 technique kind of role, and then Zion Logue right there at the center of things as sort of your nose tackle guy. But they're so deep, Philip, on that defensive line that they're going to rotate a ton and have a ton of guys. Barry Alexander's going to play a ton of snaps. Warren Brinson's going to play a ton of snaps. Jamil Waltower is going to play a role on this team. I'm interested in seeing what we see out of Christian Miller, a very talented player coming out of the 2022 recruiting class there as well. Jordan Hall and Jamal Jarrett are both on campus this spring as freshmen. You talk to some people, they think Jordan Hall has as high a ceiling as anyone in this recruiting class from Georgia's perspective in terms of the guys coming in. We've all heard with Jamal Jarrett, the Jordan Davis comps there. How quickly is he able to get his body right and get his body in shape for spring practice and for the fall? This defensive line, while, who starts first string and things like that, again, Michael Williams started 2 games for Georgia last year, but he was pretty clearly one of the more impactful players. And they're so deep and they rotate so much in that defensive line. Who officially starts is not necessarily the most important thing in the world, at least in my opinion. And there are a lot of different answers there. Isaac Washington. I was talking about this with a buddy yesterday. I believe if Georgia wanted to, Brock Bowers could finish with like 1,800 yards receiving this season. But Georgia doesn't need to do that with him. They're up so big in so many of these games, they don't need to put that kind of mileage on him. And I think they're very aware of that. You look at games, the Florida game comes to mind this past season, South Carolina as well. Even obviously the national championship game, I think, is the perfect example of this. Brock Bowers had 152 receiving yards, 1 drive into the third quarter. TCU finished the game with 152 passing yards. And so, could Brock win the Heisman Trophy? In an ideal world where you can turn injuries off and you don't have to worry about that, yeah, I think there's very much a real possibility of that happening. But because they know that, and look, like Alabama fans, and no offense, I don't mean to bring this up, and you can include Ohio State fans in this as well, we've seen the impact where losing a player of that caliber, a Jamison Williams, a Marvin Harrison Jr., or Brock Bowers, what that can do to an offense. And so it's far more important for Brock Bowers to be able to play in those playoff games, to be able to make it through the national championship game, than it is for him to say, put up 100 yards, 112 yards in a 30-point win over Missouri. And so I think that's something to be mindful of when we discuss and talk about Brock Bowers here. That is one of the stories that I'm interested in telling this spring. Brock Bowers is a guy who's already accomplished so much at the University of Georgia. What does a spring look like for him? So it'll be interesting there and seeing how things go about. And whatnot. Looks like Jeff Santel is using the Dog Nation chat function right now. He just put up a story on Jeremiah Smith, who I believe is the number 2 overall recruit. He might now be the number 1 overall recruit in the class. Regardless, he's a very, very talented receiver from the Florida area, a guy who is very much linked heavily to Dylan Raiola, the 5-star quarterback in this class, number 1 quarterback in the country. There's been a lot of talk about them two playing together. Obviously, Smith is currently committed to Ohio State, but if Georgia's able to land Raiola, I imagine, as Jeff will outline in his wonderfully written story, that if they are able to land Raiola, that would help their chances greatly in landing a talent like Smith. This will be our last question from Guatemala Mike. I do enjoy that name. How much of spring practice will you guys get to view? Right now, we don't know. I don't know how much practice availability we're going to have. We've had some in the past. We'll see. Obviously, Georgia coming off a national championship, but also some of the circumstances surrounding the program this offseason. You can understand why Kirby would be hesitant to show some of those things there. We didn't get a ton of practice viewing after the start of fall camp last year, but honestly, like at a certain point, and this is too inside baseball here, at a certain point going out to practice, because of the way Kirby set things up, the first couple of drills, it's warm-ups, it's going through individual periods. It's nothing like team or schematically or, how well guys are actually throwing the football in real contested situations anyways. At a certain point, it just evolves into taking who's out there, taking role, and sort of seeing how that goes there. So we'll see what kind of practice viewing we ultimately get. I wouldn't be surprised if the answer is 0 there, and the only time we get to see guys in pads is during the G-Day scrimmage. And I remind everyone here as well, in the run-up to both the playoff and the national championship game, when they had to have practice viewing sessions, Kirby had his guys doing yoga. So I wouldn't hold my breath for the idea that we're going to see a ton of practice this spring. So, but just because we're not going to see it doesn't mean we're not going to have news notes. We're reporting on this, a ton of stuff obviously coming this week. It's a very busy week for Dog Nation. We'll have tons of stuff covered for you. Dog Nation Daily with Brandon Adams this week. I will be producing that show tomorrow morning live in Atlanta. Jeff Santel with a potentially, I don't want to jinx it, but potentially a very special guest on Wednesday. You obviously have Mike Griffith on Monday night. He's going to have a lot more for you guys on spring practice and what is to be expected there. And look, spring practice is here. Georgia football, there'll be plenty to talk about. Not necessarily always good news this week, but we're going to keep you guys tuned in and covered as far as what comes out of that. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Connor Riley. This has been Connor in Coverage.